Go ahead.
Cool. Right. Well, welcome. The last session of the day, and probably the most scintillating subject to end the day with: sensitivity labels to secure your content. So I guess first up, if you haven't already, go see the sponsors, speak to them. Obviously, without the sponsors, these events don't happen. So big thanks to the sponsors. Bit about me. So I work for a consultancy in the UK. I'm head of modern workplace. I work with a lot of clients around how they change, and there's a lot of change going on at the moment. I also the Hat of the Grey Hat Beard podcast, and I run the London Power Platform user group. So what am I going to cover today? So I'm going to go through what the problem is, what the solution is, do a walkthrough of the demo of the tools, and then summarize what sensitivity labels are and how they can benefit you. So what's the problem? So we're all moving online. Some of us may have been planning to move online. Some of us have moved reluctantly, but pretty much all of us are now online. And our content, therefore, is on the move as well. So we have our content all over the place. We might have desktop machines, laptops, phones. We have SharePoint and OneDrive to store things in. We might be sharing that information using USB drives, hopefully not, but some people still do. But basically, our content is going between all of these different devices and different locations. And we might also be sharing that externally as well. So being able to say to somebody, oh, here's a link, ideally they will come in and they will see, a single instance of your content, your file that you're sharing with them, the data that you're sharing with them. However, there are certain situations where that isn't the case. So we might be sending copies of content. We may need to send copies of content for people to have on their own systems to keep their own records. So our content is on the move internally within our organizations, but it's also on the move externally, and it's going outside of our organizations, and it's going out to people outside. And ideally, we want to actually be able to understand what security we have on our content. So there are a couple of scenarios that I wanted to think about here. So one is confidential data. So internally within an organization, we obviously have different areas of the business who need to have access to different content. So some of it might be just confidential because maybe it's strategic planning, it's maybe the board, it's the directors, it's the people in charge who have visibility of information that they don't want everybody being able to see. And it might just be that you need to authenticate. You actually need to be a member of that organization to see that content. So it might just be that it's only visible to staff and it shouldn't be visible to anybody outside of the organization. But then we have within the organization different data that might be only visible to HR, to finance. So HR is a great example because I know HR have a lot of data about me, and I know that data is very sensitive. And I'd be confident that HR have access to it, but I wouldn't necessarily want everybody in the organization to have access to it. So I'm confident when HR have access, but I don't want everybody else to have access to it. Now, this is complicated a little bit with HR because actually HR deal with a lot of external people as well. So when we're thinking about our personal data, if you think, when we join an organization, actually, we're going to have details that we're going to send to HR and they're going to send to us. So actually HR need to be able to send confidential information outside of the organization as well. So we need to take that into account when we're thinking about how we secure this content. We need to secure it when it's at rest in our organization, but we also need to make sure that we understand how it needs to be shared outside of the organization as well. And then we have things like project data. So project data, it might just be the people who are working on that project that should be able to see it. But project data could take all sorts of different forms. It could be documents, it could be Excel spreadsheets, it could be Power BI. And inevitably with project data, we might actually be collaborating with other people. Maybe we have partners who we're bringing in to support us. Maybe we are the partner and we are going into other organizations' environments and we are collaborating with them. So we need to be able to think about how that data is actually being shared and with whom we're sharing it, whether they need to have access to it, and also maybe they need to have access to it in an offline format. So that's another factor that we need to take into account. I've worked with a partner who they actually work outside looking after the train lines in the UK, and they needed to be able to have access to content when they couldn't authenticate, and that was a very important factor, and we'll talk about why that's such an important factor as we go through. But it's very important to think about what the scope is for our data and who needs to have access to it. When do they need to have access to it, and how do we want to control who has access to it as well? So what is the solution that we're looking at here? So what we're looking at is sensitivity labels. Now, this has been around for a long time. It's been available within Azure as rights management. So it was available on premises. It was available online as rights management, and it's now coming together as a combination of different tools come together to make up what's now being called Microsoft Information Protection. And sensitivity labels is one element of that. And what it means is that we can create a hierarchy of different labels, and each of those labels we can use as a way of controlling what people can do with that content. And then when we apply that, we publish a policy which share those labels with certain people within our organization. And then once content is labeled, that content is then being controlled by the label. And the things that we can do with those labels include encrypting it. So we can encrypt the content to make sure that people can't actually open that label without going through the controls that we're setting. So whether that means that they actually have to sign in, or whether they have to use a one-time code and authenticate, we can set that so that they need to be able to do that to decrypt and therefore to be able to see that content. We can make it very visible as to how this content is being managed. So with content marking, we can say that because we're putting a label on a document, we can actually make sure that there is a header or a footer or a watermark across that document. So it's very, very visual to make sure that people can see exactly how that content is being controlled. And what we're now starting to see is that we can take these labels and we can actually apply them to sites and groups. So we can actually take a sensitivity label now and apply it to a team, for example, a Microsoft team. And we'll go through that and I'll show you how that works and what the implications of that are. And then we also have, I guess, one of the best things that we could ever hope for is auto labeling. And this is great because it removes the need for people to think about what they're labeling and to manually mark it. So with auto labeling, we can say that there are certain conditions that if the content of the document meets those conditions, therefore it's automatically going to be labeled with our sensitivity label, and therefore all of the controls will kick in around that label. So sensitivity labels provide a lot of ways that we can control that content, and it does assume that we can actually make that label stick to that document. Now, this is a really important concept. How does a label in a document actually work? When we think about our documents, they might be sitting, we might have network shares, we might have, our own laptop, maybe we're on a plane and we're offline and we're creating a document. We can still do that. How that label then gets applied to that document, it's still on your machine. It's local. So we can label content when it's on our machine, and then we can have it stored in Office 365. Now, our document is going to sit in one of our organization's sources. And the key thing about the labels here is that I can apply that label to my document on my laptop, and it sits within that document. Now, we also have something called the AIP scanner, and that allows us to actually scan our network shares and to apply the same content label, review the content and apply the labels based on the rules that we're applying to online content. So we can actually label our content when it's at rest on our network shares. And then within Office 365, we also have our auto labeling based on our content. So where it searches through the content and it finds those criteria, then the label can be applied there as well. So we have many ways that we can actually look at applying our label. And those labels, they sit in the document. So where we have things like retention and data loss prevention, and we have the labeling there, that's around the container. And that's where it's being stored, and it's not impacting the actual document. It's just saying, if it's stored in this location, we're going to apply these rules. What we're talking about with sensitivity labels is actually a label that's embedded into the document and travels with the document. So if we send or share a document and our partner organization has a copy, they will have a copy of it maybe on their laptop or anywhere else in their organization. The label will travel with that document. So any document we share, that label travels with it. And there's a very important separation between the data loss prevention labels that we see when we're looking after locations within Office 365. So we have the key concepts. We're going to apply labels. They are then going to control how that document is actually managed. So let's look at what that actually looks like within the context of a demo. So what I'm going to go through is I'm going to show you how to create a label, and then we'll create a team as well, and then I'll show you how the labels are actually used in Office. So to create a label, so we go into the Microsoft 365 Security Center. So you can see we're in under classification. If you can't see that, then show the more resources and it will show everything that's available. Within the sensitivity labels, we can see a hierarchy of labels here. Now, all of these labels, they have increasing security usually. So we usually start at the top with the least security, and at the bottom we will have the most security, and they will be applied accordingly. So what I mean by that is, if we have rules to automatically apply labels, the lower one will take precedence over the higher one because it tends to have a higher level of security. So we might be starting here with personal. So that might be in my personal document. We're not really going to do much other than just label it. Public is always an interesting one. A lot of organizations use public, but don't necessarily mean that it means it's going to be shared externally. So it's something to think about. And there are lots of caveats around how people think about the labeling and how we keep it simple. And I'll cover some of that later on. But what we really want to do is we want to make these as easy to understand and as intuitive as possible for people. Now, when we get into the hierarchies, confidential, we can have multiple variations on confidential. Now, one of the reasons for having confidential with variations is that we actually, where we're talking about HR or project data, we may actually want to share this information externally. So if we think about a highly confidential document that we want to be able to share maybe with a prospective employee or maybe with an existing employee that we want to send them a copy of their contract, we need to have some way of sending it out, but without necessarily the constraints that we would expect on most of the secure content. So this is where the subcategories come in, the sub-labeling comes in. We can say anyone not protected, whereas we might say all employees is the default that we would prefer. But we need to be able to have that get out of jail free to say, actually, if we want to email this HR document, we have an option in there. Now, obviously, we then have controls as to who we can publish these to, and I'll go through that. So it's quite important to think about when we're planning this, work with your data prevention officer, your data officer, make sure that you've got a clear understanding of what controls you need from a legislative perspective and what those exceptions might be, because I've come across it many times where you look at an organization and they say, well, we're going to use 5 labels. They put them in, but they've not really considered where people like HR, finance, the legal team need to send sensitive information outside of the organization, but only they need to do it. So there's things to consider when you're thinking about planning how these labels work. So if we go through and we create a new label, It's quite useful here because we have a friendly name, which is what people will see when they're choosing a label. And we have a description for the users that they will also see. But then we have a description for the admins as well. So we can be a little more specific when we're talking to the admins and say, actually, this is what this does, rather than this is what the purpose of this is for. This is how you apply this. So it's quite useful to separate that out to say, a user needs to understand when they apply the label, whereas the admins need to understand what happens to the content when the label is applied. So assuming we've given it a name, the next step that we have is encryption. Now, encryption is really powerful because it means that people need to be able to authenticate to be able to decrypt the file. Now, that will only work where you have you're using tools that actually understand and respect that encryption. So most tools, when they're opening a Word document, will look for the encryption and will say, actually, we know that this is being managed by a sensitivity label, so therefore it'll tell them where to go to authenticate, and to decrypt the file, the user will then need to authenticate into your Azure AD so that it can then say, yes, you have permission to decrypt this file and see the content. So this prevents people just passing a file out. So you can say, actually, I'm going to control who has access. So when we look at how we can control the access, we can control it to say users that are in our organization. So long as they have an Azure AD account in our domain, they can actually authenticate. We could say any authenticated users. So that will include guest users, and they will be able to come in. We can use the add users and groups to restrict who can have access to content. So where we were talking about maybe HR content, or maybe the board of governors or the directors, if we've got a group, we can restrict that access to that particular group. So only those users will be able to have access to these files. It's a very strict rule to put in place, but there are times when it's needed. But it does make it more complicated when you're thinking about the number of labels that you might actually have. And then we can also say specific email addresses or domains. So this is really useful when you're working maybe in a partnership with another organization and you want to just have files that are shared between your two organizations, but you don't necessarily know who in the other organization is going to have access to it. So some really powerful ways to control who can actually have access to the content in your file. So when we look at the users and we want to add a group in, as I say, we can use particular individuals or we can use a particular group within our organization. We can then choose permissions. So by default, co-author is what most people will have access to. Now, this is very much controlling, once you've authenticated and you've decrypted the file, what can you actually do with the file afterwards? So where we see this, co-author can do everything except edit the rights, export the content. If we want to, we can actually have different roles. So we can choose the different roles, and by default, there are certain roles that are set up already. So the co-owner, co-author, reviewer, viewer. So that makes it very easy for us to say, actually, maybe we want to share content with an external party or an area in our organization, but we want them only to be a reviewer or only to have view permissions. So they can essentially open the file up, but they can't actually edit the file. So it gives us a lot of granularity here. And then if we want to, we can have custom. So where we've got custom roles, we can create these. The granularity that we can go down to at this point is really powerful. And there's a lot of our clients, that certainly the clients that I work with when they're in healthcare and things, they want to be able to say, I want to control who can print, who can copy, who can download files, and we can do that in this way. So we can say, don't forward, don't reply, that counts for emails, print, copy and extract, save, so you can't save any changes to the file. So it gives us a lot of granularity as to what we can actually do with the files once we've decrypted it. So the next section that we go through is the content marking. Content marking it sounds really positive, that we can actually have a visual mark, and I'll show you what that looks like. One thing to consider around the content marking is that actually, if we automatically apply a label, because it doesn't open the document in Word, Excel, PowerPoint, it won't automatically label it, but it will do when that file is actually opened in one of those tools and the user has permissions to mark the document. So there's some caveats around how effective this is in terms of how powerful a tool it is when you're auto labeling content based on the content in that document. But when we go into this, the options that we have, we can use the watermark text. So we basically put in a text. We can put the font size, the color. For the watermarks, we can say, do we want it to be diagonal or horizontal? For the headers and the footers, we can say, do we want it aligned left, center, or right? So it's worth experimenting to see how this looks. If you have corporate branding on your documents, a corporate livery, then it's worth just checking to see how this plays with your corporate branding. Some organizations really don't like the headers and the footers, the watermarks, because it has less impact on their branding. Play with this and just see how this works for your organization. So the next section that we get to, so this one's relatively new, the site and group settings. Now, this part plays into essentially when we're creating a repository for our information, what can we control as to who has access to that particular site? And this will work for a SharePoint site. It'll also work for Office 365 groups as well. So we have some options in there. So we've got the public option selected at the moment, but actually in there we've got the private, none. So we can choose who has access to that. If I just quickly come back there, we also have this option, external users. So let Microsoft 365 group owners add people outside the organization. So essentially we can say, if somebody applies this sensitivity label to a Microsoft team or a SharePoint site, they cannot add in other people. Which is a really useful tip when we're saying we want to have maybe our project sites to be internal. So we give them a sensitivity label that only allows internal people to have access. And then we can also have another sensitivity label, which is maybe for a public project or a collaborative project site, and that allows people to add external users in. So we can control that based on the sensitivity label that is applied to that particular site. We then have the options for the unmanaged access. So in terms of the devices, basically this is like conditional access. We can control what you can actually do based on whether your device is registered as a managed device or is an unmanaged device. It's important to note for these sensitivity labels, what we are not doing is trying to set the sensitivity label for all of the content. This won't actually do that. So where you create a team with a sensitivity label, the content won't inherit that sensitivity label. This is only for control over the container. So as I say, there are different options there, public, private, none, in terms of who can access it. So once we've got the site, we then have the auto labeling for Office apps. Now, what this means is that if I'm working in Word and I type in a set of data, set of content, if that content actually registers as a sensitive information type, then it can actually trigger a condition that says, actually, we're going to apply this label. So this is a really powerful tool to say, you've typed something in. So you've typed a credit card number, therefore we're going to either automatically label your document, or we are going to suggest that you label your document with this particular sensitivity label. So it's a very powerful tool for users when they're actually working in the Office suite. So we've got a few things here. So in terms of the options, the sensitive information types, I can't remember exactly how many there are, but there's 100 or so sensitive information types that are defined. You can actually create your own, but there's also trainable classifiers. So, and this is where it's looking for linguistic patterns to say, is it offensive text? These are relatively new, and they're basically trying to identify language rather than words. So when we choose the sensitive information types, as I say, that what we tend to have to start with is the common patterns for insurance numbers, license numbers, passport numbers, common patterns that are essentially stored as regular expressions in there. And that means that we can create our own as well. So you can see there I've got a couple of different ones. So one that checks for just CPS and one that actually checks for the word atomic. And if I'm using those, they're basically looking for specific patterns, and that will register as a sensitive information type. So this is really useful when you are starting to say content in your organization maybe is related to a key ID format that you use for registering assets. So I've seen this with housing associations where they register properties with a certain formatted code, and therefore they're going to use that formatted code as a sensitive information type, and anything that they find with it, they will label it. So it's a very powerful tool to be able to actually use a regular expression within this format to identify sensitive information types that are relevant for your organization. We can put quite complex rules in here, so we can add groups of things that we might be checking for in terms of, you know, rather than just having one sensitive information type, we might be looking for a combination of information types. And then we also have things like the accuracy. How accurate do we think our matching is to identify what we're looking for? So we can control that as well. And we can control the instance as well. So we could be saying, if you put one credit card in, we're going to do one thing, but if you're going to put 5 of them in, then we're actually going to block that going out of the organization, and we're going to apply a sensitivity label that has a higher level of control. So we've got controls here to say how we measure the severity of our matches, and then that helps us apply a sensitivity label. And as I mentioned before, we can automatically apply the label, or we can just recommend that users apply it. And this is useful when we might be introducing our labels, you know, when we want to actually start training our users in what they're looking for. When it comes up and it says, well, we recommend that you apply this label, as opposed to automatically applying it, it starts to build up a little more resilience in our users in terms of they're not being immediately blocked from doing things, but they are more likely to respond positively to being recommended to do things. So it's a good way to introduce sensitivity labels into your organization. And with that, we've got basically all of the controls within our sensitivity label. That gives us everything that we want to control around a document that has that label associated with it. Are there any questions at this point? Just check and see if there are any questions in the chat. No questions? Okay, I'll carry on. If you just drop any questions into the chat, I will check it periodically as we go through. So we've created our label. We now need to publish our labels. So we do this via a policy. And the reason that we do this via policy is because we may very well want to publish different labels to different people. And so taking a bunch of labels and publishing them to an audience is really useful. So where we've got the label policies, we give them the name. So you can see that I've got one in there for default everyone. So that would be all of the default labels to everyone. But I might just as well have one in there that is just for finance or just for HR, and they might be publishing slightly different sets of policies of labels to those audiences. So if we create a new policy, the first thing that we need to do is to select the labels that we want to publish. So here, as I was saying earlier, where we've got our hierarchies, we can actually choose which ones we want to publish. So if we were publishing to HR, then we could say, actually, we want them to be able to share that confidential with anyone or with specific recipients, but maybe the rest of the organization, we would only give them the all employees, because we don't want them to have the ability to actually share that content externally. If they don't have the ability to put that label on, then they won't have the ability to actually share it. That's the way we want it to work. So when we're thinking about who we want to publish to, and we're thinking about what they can actually do and what features and functionality they actually need. So we choose our set of labels first. We then choose who do we actually want to select. So we've got, by default, we've got all users and groups within our organization. When we go into the choose, we can actually choose, who do we have? Do we have individuals or do we have groups? And we can actually select either a set of individuals or we can select groups in there as well. Once we've selected who we want to actually publish our labels to, then we look at the policy settings. Now, this is really powerful, because what this gives us is the ability to actually say, well, which is the default label? And if we look at the default labels, then we will have, the selection of labels that we actually selected previously, and we can choose one and say, actually, okay, it's going to be a default label. That means these people will have a default label for every document that they create. So we can choose a default. What we can then do within this is we can actually say users must provide a justification if they remove or lower the label. So where we had the original list of labels, if they choose to actually change a default label or one that's been automatically applied to something that has a lower control, then they have to provide justification as to why they have done that. Very, very useful thing to do. Makes people think twice about why they're doing it as well. Requires users to apply a label. Now, this is a really useful one. You want to be able to say to your users, we're taking away some of the pain of you thinking about it. However, you can't remove any of the labels. So you have to have at least one label. So this is where planning your labeling policy and your strategy around labeling is really important. What is the default label that you want people to have? Then you can start to say it requires a label for every document that people create. And that last one, provide users with a link to a custom help page. If there's one thing that you absolutely must do on every single policy that you have, is provide a link so that people can go to a page and understand what these labels are there for. It causes no end of confusion when you introduce sensitivity labels to an organization, but you're not explaining to users why they would apply these labels and how to apply these labels. And I mean that not in the technical, well, I have to click these buttons, but how do I judge which label is the most appropriate for this particular document that I'm working with? They might have the recommendations come through when they put certain keywords in, but not every document will contain those keywords. So it's very important to be really clear in the communication when you're starting to plan how you roll this out, and then actually to support and reinforce the logic that people need to use to say, this is why you apply this label to this document, because it contains this type of information. So you can put a URL in, and the URL should be somewhere easy to find on your intranet. It makes all the difference in the world in terms of what sort of response you get from your end users when you roll out sensitivity labels to the organization. And then you have, so interestingly, you've got name your policy coming as the last thing that you do. Naming the policy is really important for me, because I want to always know essentially what group of labels are being applied and to whom they are being applied. And that's basically the combination that we're looking at here. We're looking at which group of labels and which group of users, and each policy is bringing those together. So make sure you name the policies in a way that makes sense and is understandable for your admins when they come into this section. Excellent. So we've created all of our labels, and we have published our policies. It does take some time for that publication to take place, so certainly if it's the first time that you're setting this up. So I wouldn't expect it to be done overnight. I would leave it at least 24 hours. So very quickly, are there any questions? So, question from Veronique: is there a way to remove labels from documents already marked? Yes, there is. You can remove the labels if you have the policy that says that you don't have to apply a label to every document. So that checkbox that was in the policy means that those users that policy is published to, they have to apply to that document. If you are a user and you're a member of a different group, then you could remove those labels. So yes, there is a way for documents to have their labels removed. Okay, so as a user now, what do I need to do when I create a file? So this is, I would say this is in a state of flux. They're changing the way this works as they've moved around between the old Azure rights management services and moving into Azure information protection, and then it's still in the transition to move to Microsoft information protection. So this is a bit of a moving feast at the moment in terms of what the experience is like. And I would certainly suggest that you check out the site that the document that they have around that transition from AIP to MIP as well. I'll put a link out about that. So we're in Word here, and what we have is we have sensitivity up in that top right hand corner. Now, some of you may be familiar with the information protection bar, and I'll come on to some of the differences in the way that the different tools work based on whether you are using the classic information protection or the new Office information protection. And what I'm using at the moment is just the out of the box. So I've not deployed anything new into this because most of the organizations I'm working with at the moment tend to be in a situation where they are trying to use as many of the out of the box tools without having the overhead of installing add-ins into Office or into onto users' machines. So we have the sensitivity up there, and when we click on that, it pulls down our list of labels that have been published to us. So at the bottom we can see that learn more option. So that's where it jumps off to the URL that we would have put in, which has the help of, well, what do all of these labels mean and how do I choose which label is right for this document that I'm creating. And you can see that where we've got the hierarchy, so the confidential, we've then got anyone not protected or all employees. So I have two of the sub factors, sub options in there, and that's where I can choose with my policy, what do people actually see when they pull that sensitivity drop down, and that's very powerful for them to be able to choose what they see. Once I've selected something, so I've selected highly confidential. So you can see on the document we've got our header and we've got our watermark, and this is where this often interrupts with the branding, where you've got the header and the footer is very similar, whereas the watermark tends not to interrupt with the actual branding. Now we get this yellow bar come across the top because we've got our encryption there, so it's changing the permissions, and then we can see what permissions we're going to have. If we have a label that doesn't actually change the permissions, then what we see is just a very subtle, it just tells us highly confidential, all employees at the bottom. So it's important to be aware and to make your users aware what you would be expecting to see as a user when you actually select one of these sensitivity labels. And the same thing will happen if you type type content in and it automatically applies. The watermarks will appear and the bars will appear at the top in terms of that yellow bar at the top. So when we come back, we can change our labels if we want to. And when we're in, so this is Word Online, so very similar experience. And I think we're seeing more clients using Word Online, and it's one of the important things that we need to take into account is how much parity there is between the features for the online experience when you're just using Word Online or using Word in Teams, for example, versus using the full fat tools that you actually have on the desktop. And again, where we see a document, it has a label, but we can only see highly confidential, all employees at the bottom. So it's very subtle, and we need to make it very clear when users are going to see the different markings on the interface that they're using. So in email, we've got sensitivity. Again, very similar. You choose your sensitivity, and then again, it comes up with a message at the top. It's not highlighted in yellow, but you've got those messages up at the top. And then if you try and change it, it will say, what's the justification? So this is where, when we've put in the message to say a user needs to enter a justification, they can select from, previous label was incorrect, previous label no longer applies, or actually enter text to describe why they're changing the label. And again, this is audited against the document. So it's very useful to have all of this in there. When we actually start to put something together and send an email, so we have highly confidential. So this one, data that allows employees to view. So this is really employees. So we shouldn't be able to send this. So when we get a message, and the message will say, so only file attachment report rights management. So again, this comes back to what I was saying earlier. Word and most tools that open Word files will respect the rights management, and therefore will actually be able to decrypt it. Other file types may not actually have the same experience. So when we send this, what we get back is an email that says the message was blocked. Sensitive email, employees only. So we get it sent back to us. We've got the label there. And we've got a message that is from our administrators here. Now, if we send something that is permitted, so moving over to a different machine, so this is as an end user. So I have this document. It's now come through because it's the highly confidential recipients that it has. So I use Outlook Online. So when I use Outlook and I click on that, I get a message and it says, sorry, Word can't open this document in a browser. And this goes for all of the online versions of Office. So Word in Teams, online, it won't be able to decrypt it. So it won't actually be able to say, this has been sent to you or shared with you from a different organization. I can't do the authentication to that organization to allow me to decrypt this file. So I need to download that. And when I download that file, it then asks me to sign in. So this is where this file is encrypted. I have to authenticate to Azure AD to actually decrypt this file. Now this gets really confusing. And for me, this is one of the biggest challenges with the education, not only of clients, but of their partners, because I'm opening a document here and I'm in my organization and I'm being asked to sign in. So I'm going to sign in with my own credentials. That's good. Now I'm being asked for a code. Now I'm signed in my organization. It's got my email address. It's even got my organization's branding and my organization's messages at the bottom. However, I'm actually, because I'm signing into the partner organization, it's asking me for a code from the Authenticator app based on my login to their organization, not to my own organization. And we see this quite a lot, that it creates confusion as to, well, which code should I be using if I'm signed in? So you might be like me with Authenticator app with quite a few different Office 365 tenants. It's then understanding which one should I actually be using. And this is where actually training your clients and your partners is actually quite important as well when you start to introduce sensitivity labels. So if I go through this, if I were doing this for the first time, I might actually have this show up, which is actually where that my partner organization actually has terms of use, conditional access, all of those good things for guest users. So I might actually have to go through this process as well. So it's well worth understanding what it is that you can and can't do as an external user, and what you should expect when they actually start to go through the process of actually opening a file that your organization has encrypted. For this, I would suggest having help pages that actually you can direct your external partners to, that are on your website, that just explain exactly what the process might look like to them. So I was going to take a screenshot once I'd opened the file, but because I'd selected an option where I couldn't take a screenshot, I quite literally, every time I went to take a screenshot, it just blocked it. And that's part of the benefits of what sensitivity labels can do. You can't take a screenshot on your phone, you can't save it, etc. So I'm just conscious of time. So creating a team. So we talked about how the team is basically, you go through the creation of the team, and we're going to apply a sensitivity label to the container. So when I come in and I say I want to build a team from scratch, what I get is a drop down for the sensitivity. Now, it starts with the default of general, which is what we set up in the policy. And because it's general, I don't get the option to create a private team. I've got a public team. Now, if I pull that drop down, then I get the other options. So I can see, again, I can see the description, and I can see the options, and I can see the hierarchy. So if I say confidential all employees, what I then get is the label to say it's confidential all employees at the top, and then I can only create a private team. So this is where understanding that sensitivity labels are being applied in this way. Again, it's a communication exercise to make sure people understand, well, what is the purpose of their team, and how do they actually then choose what sensitivity they should have for their team. And again, just a reminder, by applying this label, this sensitivity label, to this team, we're not applying it to all of the content that will be created in the team. This is the container that we're applying it to. Once we've created that team, another thing that is a little frustrating at times is where you've got those hierarchies, you don't see the full hierarchy when it shows you the label. So in most cases, I see the clients that I'm working with not going down the route of using the hierarchies because it isn't as visible as it needs to be in all situations. So it's another thing to take into account when you're planning your sensitivity labels. Those hierarchies, whilst they work very effectively and they're kind of intuitive, they don't always present the information effectively. Okay, so a few points of caution. So I've raised a few points, but I think one of the big things that some organizations have been caught out by is that encrypted files, because they're encrypted by their very nature, unless you have a key, you can't get into them. So sensitivity labels, if you're encrypting, you can't apply them to previously encrypted files because you can't see what's in that file. That's always been a challenge with SharePoint Search as well, where if you have a file that has come from a separate organization and you can't actually open that file and decrypt it, then it can't be indexed, and therefore it can't be searched, and the automated activities won't be able to take place either. The other one is encrypted files can't be co-authored. Now, this is a really quite a significant one in some scenarios, because a lot of organizations look at teams and they look at the benefits of co-authoring, but as soon as you apply encryption, that can't take place. So it's just something to be aware of. And again, whilst if you use the encryption out of the box in Office 365, SharePoint can decrypt that now. If you do hold your own key, then you won't be able to use SharePoint won't be able to access the files. It won't be able to open them, decrypt them, and actually interrogate them. So it's something to be aware of in terms of how that encryption works for your internal files. And I alluded to this earlier. There are multiple interfaces. So the classic client and the unified client are both additional installations that hook into Word and the rest of the Office suite. They have to be installed onto the machines where those applications are working. And then we've got the Office built in, which is what I was showing you. So what you can see here is some of the things that you can't do with just the built-in Office. So the mandatory labeling, it will default it, but it doesn't force you. The label inheritance from email attachments. This is probably one of the biggest reasons that I see for pushing clients to put that unified client in, is basically when you take a document and it has a higher sensitivity than maybe your default for an email, your email will inherit that higher sensitivity label, and therefore all of the controls and the security that relate to the document you're attaching will actually then apply to that email as well. A very, very powerful tool. Makes users much less likely to accidentally send out important documents to the outside world. Custom permissions, if users want to actually control how those permissions are set up. The information protection bar as well. So where I was showing you the very subtle labeling at the bottom of the page in Office and Outlook, the information protection bar just sits across the top of the application, just underneath the ribbon all of the time, even if you are not encrypting it and impacting the behavior of the document. So it's a very powerful tool to keep it front and center for users to be able to see the labeling. And then the label with File Explorer is useful if you just need to label things that are on your machine. Most of the organizations I work with don't actually use that very often, but it is quite a useful tool. Some real world considerations. So when you're thinking about using the labeling, think about the AIP scanner. So this is a tool that takes your rules and can apply the labels to the files in your network drives. It can be a really useful exercise when you're actually looking at migrating content. You can pre-label it if you need to, which is very powerful. Automate labeling using sensitive data types. The more you take away the burden from end users, the easier it is to introduce these. Keep the number of labels low. So don't have 100 different labels. People will just get confused and they won't use them effectively. Use as few as you possibly can do. And when you start out, use less labels with less controls, and then as people get used to them, you can introduce more labels with more controls into them. Provide guidance on how to use those labels. Make sure that your external users also have access to them, to that guidance, because you need to make sure they are not caught out by what you're doing. Your hierarchy, keep it simple. Try and make it as flat as possible so that you've got that visibility at all times, rather than just seeing the employee, all employees. You'd want to just keep them top level, I would suggest. You can also apply the labels to Power BI, and that means that if you pull that data out into Excel, Excel will actually inherit from those particular those sensitivity labels. So think about not only documents, emails, but also think about your actual data, because this is where Microsoft information protection means so much more than just Azure or Office 365. It's all of your content that you should be thinking about. So the future, we've got a few things that are coming. So control over external sharing. So I'm looking forward to this one. This one's kind of like what we're doing with the Teams, but it means that you're actually at label level controlling whether a document can be shared externally. So sensitivity labels, data loss prevention coming together. I think this will be a really powerful tool for those labels. Under visibility, they're starting to really actually build out what it is that you can actually see in terms of the labels that are being applied, the number of changes when they're being downgraded, and this will be even more powerful as you start to get more visibility of what people are doing, more as almost an auditable control, but also as a way of evidencing the security that you have in place. So it's a very powerful tool if you get audited for security and things. So very quick summary, keep the labels simple. Be clear about the purpose of your labels, why you applying a label. Don't worry so much about what the label does, but tell people when to apply them. Automate the labeling where possible to remove the need for users to think. Test, test, and test. Make sure that you are not adversely impacting your users by maybe applying controls that are too rigid for them. And be prepared for internal and external questions. External users will be as impacted by you sending them an encrypted document as your internal users will be. So really think about the whole strategy that you have for how these sensitivity labels will be used. And with that, another thank you to our sponsors. And are there any questions? See, are there any questions? No questions. You've either all fallen asleep or that made perfect sense.
You were just very, very clear in your presentation. So no questions, I guess.
Excellent. Well, if you do think of any questions, feel free to reach out. I'm on Twitter. I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Great. Thank you, Alan. Oh, there's a question now.
A question. Does the unified client also imply that desktop Office products are being used? Yes, so the unified client, basically it's where we used to have Office 365 labeling and Azure AIP, and it's the unification of that labeling. So the unified client picks up on both of those, and essentially you manage it all in the Office 365 client in the security side of things. But it's got all of the, it's not the separated tool. The classic one is just the Azure information protection. So yes, it works for most versions of Office. I think there are some of the older ones it won't work so well on, but it's designed to actually work on all the versions of Office. Well, now the closing and the raffle, that sounds really important.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a housekeeping message. Next session will be on the welcome or lobby team. There's a link there. But if you can continue for 4 more minutes, Alan.
Oh, okay. So we've got yes. So how long has the sensitivity label been here and used? It's been around for a very long time. So the sensitivity labels, as I say, they used to be in Active Directory under the rights management service, and essentially they've moved slowly up to Azure AD and into Azure Information Protection, and now they're being unified with the labeling so that it's across the board in Microsoft Information Protection. So it's been around for quite a long time. Haven't worked. So Tammy says she hasn't worked with sensitivity labels. Let me know if you have any questions. They can be quite, the biggest challenge with working with sensitivity labels tends not to be the technology, but the business. It tends to be speaking with your security officers, your data protection officers, putting together a strategy that is relatively easy to roll out to start with, and starting with small steps, because otherwise it becomes too big a challenge to make big changes. So start small, try it out with a small group. You can publish the policies to a select group of people, try it that way, roll out a pilot, and then extend it out from there. Excellent. No other questions? Excellent. Off to the main group for the raffle then.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Alan, for your session. It was great. Really, really informative.
Thank you very much.
I was really happy to have you here. So we're going to move to the other team. The link is on the chat window. If you have any questions, we'll be around. See you soon.
Excellent. Thanks a lot.